Karl-Anthony Towns is now a New York Knick. There's been another NBA shift in terms of overall talent, and while the New York Knicks definitely made a move, is there a way that this is going to affect the Brooklyn Nets in the future with the picks and whatnot? We'll get into it all, but first, theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, and today kind of the Knicks every single day. I'm Doug Norrie, no Adam Armbrecht on the show today as we get going into another week, heading into October here with training camp around the corner. We already have media day in the rear view, which we'll get to a little bit later in the week, talk about what Jordi Fernandez and Sean Marks and others had to say, plus a bunch of NBA or Nets media stuff coming later this week. So we'll have it all covered for you there. But obviously, when we get closer to the season, this is when the bigger news, NBA news, starts heating up. We get just a ramp up in overall coverage. And sometimes on a weekend, you get a blockbuster trade that changes slightly or maybe majorly the landscape of the NBA. And that's what we got here this weekend with Karl-Anthony. Friday evening, huge news. Karl-Anthony Towns traded to the New York Knicks for Julius Randle, for Donte DiVincenzo. The Knicks continue to push the chips all in here in what they see as a championship window and add a major talent in Karl-Anthony Towns. We'll talk about sort of what this means for the Knicks, what this means for the NBA writ large, and what it specifically means for the Brooklyn Nets, because they, down the line, what the Knicks do in the short term and maybe the long term does affect how the Nets sort of view some future assets. And it matters for the part beyond where just the fans, Nets fans are out there wanting to ferociously root against the Knicks. We already know that's the case with a big segment of the fan base, that it's sometimes not good enough even for the Knicks to win. The Knicks have to lose too, right? Like, this is just part of, the New York sports culture. This is part of, these, I wouldn't even call it a rivalry, but just when you're in the same geographic area as another team, especially with a team like the Knicks, who have longstanding sort of tradition in New York City, and the Nets, who are relatively new to the city overall, there's these feelings that just kind of get drummed up between the fan bases, and this is what's always going to happen. So, but beyond that, just the part where they were always sort of tied just because they're a few subway stops from each other. We also get a part where after the Mikal Bridges trade, where the Knicks begin sending out picks, now Nets fans and maybe the Nets front office too can now sort of be actively rooting against the Knicks in the future, because it's like, well, it's bad. If the Knicks are bad, then those picks are going to end up looking better and better. So in the past, where we had a situation where it's just like, it'd just be nice if the Knicks weren't that good, so you don't have to hear it from our Knick friends out there. It's something even more now as we look way out into the future, and how these two teams are now tied together in terms of future assets. Specifically, like I said, if the Knicks start to crater at some point over the next 5 years, Nets could be in a position where they could capitalize off of it. So we'll get into some of what that asset allocation looks like and sort of where the Knicks stand. But just on a high level, this move for Karl-Anthony Towns going to the Knicks, when you talk about Julius Randle, sending him out, when you talk about Donte DiVincenzo, who was a huge part of the Knicks run last season, no doubt about it. This is what you would consider to be a talent consolidation, right? Where it's like taking two players and consolidating down into one, in Karl-Anthony Towns, who's better than those two other players, though has question marks of his own going forward. On a high level, these are the moves I always like in the NBA. And this is actually kind of even independent of maybe what you feel about Karl-Anthony Towns. So even if and he's a kind of a polarizing talent in the NBA for what he is. And I know there's a group of people out there that think he's, not nearly as good as the contract. Then there's going to be the group that thinks that he's like maybe underrated. And the truth is probably somewhere in between in terms of Karl-Anthony Towns' overall talent. So I get that he's like not like this perfect sort of like superstar type to fit into these trades where everyone just kind of agrees he's amazing. Like, it's not like the Kevin Durant thing. Oh, you signed Kevin Durant? Okay, well, we all agree he's amazing. Like, there's no one's really out there doing the anti-Kevin Durant side, right? And so it's clearly not into that caliber of player. Even like the Nets trading for James Harden, I think it was probably more universally agreed upon where sort of Harden stood in the overall talent NBA landscape at the time than Karl-Anthony Towns does. And that was even with like Harden coming in super out of shape and wanting out of the Rockets and whatnot, right? So I think that like Karl-Anthony Towns doesn't fit into that exact archetype of player and superstar, even though he's paid like one for sure going out here. But I don't think there's really any. I'm not sure I can hear many sides against where the Knicks starting five didn't get better here, right? This is a team that just went to the Eastern Conference Finals, that played, or excuse me, Eastern Conference semifinals, played really, really well. Were basically decimated by injuries at the end. Already did it without Julius Randle, who they sent out in the trade because Randle wasn't even part of that group because he had been injured. Donte played really, really well. Obviously, we know that he was a huge part of why they made it that far. But with Karl-Anthony Towns, the Knicks are signing, a 7-footer who basically shoots 30%, or excuse me, 40% from three over his career. Does not have the same defensive acumen that they have, maybe want from a center, but you also have a floor spacing big, which is basically impossible to really add to your roster going, on any functional level at this point in the NBA, like just like where the NBA stands. So I don't think you can really make a lot of cases that the Knicks aren't better around their core five than they were on Thursday evening, right? Trade made Friday evening. Now Thursday, Thursday evening, they had one team. Friday evening, they had another team. I think that most would agree that this core five of Jalen Brunson, Mikal Bridges, Josh Hart, OG Anunoby, and Karl-Anthony Towns is a better starting five than they had before, right? That they maybe are closer to pushing in for a championship than they were before. How much? Maybe it's only, a few steps forward in terms of being able to contend with the Boston Celtics. But if you look at just, getting better kind of on paper, Karl-Anthony Towns, I think, represents that, even for his issues defensively at times, or maybe the fit that he had with some of those Wolves lineups. And he had a dreadful Western Conference Finals series against Dallas last year. Though I will say, look, he was on a team that made the Western Conference Finals, right? So I know people want to sometimes take a dig at that he wasn't that good in those finals in the WCF, but they were there, right? He was playing in those, and you really can't take that away. And so I think when you look at the starting five, there's probably going to be question marks around sort of like maybe the overall fit. Maybe you're a little bit worried about the interior defense. Maybe you're worried about some of those other pieces. But in terms of like adding a 7-footer that can space the floor and run stuff with Jalen Brunson and be maybe the second leading scorer on the team with a versatility that maybe Julius Randle didn't have already. And maybe you look at Donte DiVincenzo and maybe say, hey, in the current NBA, that's a little easier to replace. I really like this kind of move. I like these big moves for NBA teams that are in this window. I like going for it. I like pushing your chips in. I like taking a risk, right? Like thinking maybe a little bit outside the box. I do in short windows. I'm almost always going to root for teams that do that because I think that is what you should be doing. And I think for the Knicks, the Karl-Anthony Towns move does represent that. Want to talk about what this means sort of like for the Knicks cap situation and what it means going forward with the Nets. We'll take a look at what are some of the assets the Nets are looking at in the future from the Knicks. We'll talk about that here in 1 second. First, I'm going to tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. Look, if you're a fan of the NFL, I know I am recording this on a Sunday. You start the season big with a big return on FanDuel. It's America's #1 sportsbook. Maybe you're getting a hunch in the middle of the game. You can check out the latest stats. You can view the play-by-play and so much more. The same page where you're placing your bets. No better deal than that. You're going to get started over on FanDuel with $200 in bonus bets. That's going to be guaranteed. That's $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place just your first $5 bet. $200 in bonus bets over on FanDuel when you place that first $5 real money bet. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, talking about what the Knicks look like in the short term and the long term, right? So we basically went over what their starting five is going to be. They sacrificed a little bit of depth here for sure, but for me, I'm always a little less worried about that when you have just like, you consolidated your talent around the top. I think that like the depth can be something you work on or just try to make do with and whatever going forward. What's interesting now for the Knicks is these next couple of years, they're for sure going to be within this title contention, short of just injuries aside. I know people are saying, well, Cat's an injury prone player. I mean, he played like 90% of the games 3 years ago, and he played 73 total games last year. That including playoffs. So yeah, there's injury stuff, but that's like not my biggest concern with this. I think if you're the Knicks, when you're a Nets fan, and you're looking at the Knicks, what you're looking at here is where their money is going over the next few years. This is a team already into the they're just below the second apron right now. They got OG Anunoby on the books basically for $40 million and then escalating all the way through 28-29 player option. They got Jalen Brunson, who admittedly gave a free very team friendly deal, which is for sure helping them bringing in other stuff. He's 35 million plus, and then all the way to 43 million in 28-29. These guys are both 27 and 28 years old. They got Mikal Bridges, who's going to be up for an extension here next year. You would think he's almost for sure going to get it. He's going to probably ask for the bag because he's been playing on a really team friendly contract basically forever now. So he's going to get paid. They got Josh Hart in a pretty good deal at 20.9. And then they got Karl-Anthony Towns now going out until 28-29, where that ramps all the way up to $61 million. And I'm just going to go ahead and say right now that Karl-Anthony Towns in his age, 27-28, in his age 32 year is going to be picking up that $61 million. That's just me. It's a guess right now, but I feel pretty confident saying that he's going to pick that one up. So the Knicks are definitely looking at a team where they are all in around the starting five at huge numbers, and they're going to have very little cap flexibility going forward, and probably very little move flexibility going forward. Maybe they're able to get off the Mitchell Robinson contract here this year and next year, right? Like he's up. There's been already rumors that they're going to possibly try to move off that. I wouldn't be shocked on that one. And they really don't have anything else after that, right? It's like Miles McBride. It's Jericho Sims is around there. Old Nets friend. Is Bates Diop? I can't remember if they cut him or not. Anyway, some of these guys are just like they're for next year, right? And then not really money after that. They're going to be looking at basically league minimums in terms of contracts going forward. Again, no problem. Oh, sorry. And Precious Achiuwa? No. Okay. So no problem in terms of like going this route. I think I totally agree with what they did here, but you have to also be clear that going forward, there's going to be significant financial restraints on them and asset restraints on them because they've traded a lot of their picks between the Mikal Bridges trade and now the Karl-Anthony Towns trade where they unloaded a pick. They are really not the assets for them going forward are not that plentiful. Again, not dissimilar to where the Nets were right after this stage. When the Nets had Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and James Harden, they mortgaged all of their short-term and sort of like medium-term future to make sure that they had all those guys on the books. And we sat through this part with the Nets after a couple of years of sort of like wondering what the future hold. Different because Kevin Durant wanted out and Kyrie Irving wanted out and James Harden wanted out and everyone wanted to be traded. So I don't necessarily foresee that happening with the Knicks, right? This like massive fallout of personalities of just everyone all of a sudden not wanting to be in the same room with each other. I don't think the Knicks are at risk of like that happening necessarily in the same way, but we see what happens when teams look toward the future, forego the future in terms of making sure they have all the players that they want in the short term. The Nets did this and they had to reset the whole franchise. And luckily we're able to claw some of their own picks back. We're watching the Clippers go through this in real time now where it just didn't work. They did it. It didn't work. And now they're just stuck in this like weird no man's land. Like Paul George wants out and he goes somewhere else. Kawhi Leonard's hurt, right? Because he's aging up. And then it's a team around James Harden and they really have no picks or anything or any young talent because they went in on this group of guys that was going to win. When you do this is a lot of time what happens later on. That's just the nature of it. And so if you're trying to prognosticate out sort of like where these Knicks picks that are going to get conveyed to the Nets in the future look like, I think you have to feel, bullish on the Nets' chances of being able to capitalize in some way on a Knicks future. Again, not exactly the same comp as some of these other guys, but also the guys that the Knicks are operating with here aren't totally on the younger side of things, right? OG Anunoby in his age 27 season, Brunson going in his age 28 season, Bridges 28, Josh Hart 29. Right. These guys are already, Cat's 27, 28. I had this right in front of me. He's one of those two. Yeah, Cat's 28. All right, so these guys are age 28 season. By the end of this run and around the time that the Nets picks are going to be theoretically moving in the direction of them getting them from the Knicks, these guys are going to be in their low 30s. Not super long in the tooth for the NBA, but not young either, right? If you look at the best players in the league, those players are usually in that 27, 28, 29 range. Again, going back to this, why I agree with the Knicks doing this now. You have guys in their primes. This is when they're going to play probably their best. This is when you go for it. That makes sense. Now I'm only looking at 4 years down the line, when these guys are 3-4 years older, when they've had some playoff runs, when they've had some more mileage on them, because these teams are going to go to the playoffs. These teams are going to probably have some longer playoff runs. There's going to be more miles than everybody. And that stuff starts to stack up later on down the line. The reason it's important to look at is because it's not just guessing about what the Knicks picks are going to look like for the Nets, but it's going to be how the rest of the league views these picks too, right? We just talked for a year about how awesome these Suns picks are going to be, right? With this, like, not exactly the same situation, but not so dissimilar, right? Like Kevin Durant, he's older. Bradley Beal, injured and older. But it's like everyone's looking at these Suns picks as they head into the second apron and being like, oh my God, these might be the most valuable assets going in the NBA. Like like the idea, because sometimes the idea of picks is stronger than the actual value of the picks themselves. The idea that these picks are valuable means significantly more than whether the value actually ends up conveying, right? Like those Suns picks will look so valuable to the Rockets that they were willing to reset and send back the Nets picks just to get their hands on those Suns picks. And the Nets stink, right? Now they were probably not going to be as incentivized to stink without their picks back, but you see what I mean about sometimes just the idea of what can happen in the future can lend you value right now, right? Yeah, could we be wrong about it? Could the Knicks be good for the next decade? They could be. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible, right? If I was just trying to graph out sort of the probabilities around these things, but that's why we sometimes want to know how everyone else views these assets, because knowing how others will view them will help us view how valuable they are when you want to use them in a trade of your own, right? To consolidate your own asset, you consolidate your own player talent later on, right? After the Nets get through this first couple of years of tanking and the Cooper Flaggs or Ace Baileys of the world are in, right? Or the Boozers of the world are here. The AJs in the world are in here. And that the Nets are looking at that kind of talent. Like, what might they want to consolidate some of their own talent later on? And could a group of picks from the Knicks that maybe some see as valuable be important? Yeah, this is why it's worth it to look at that. So this is where you start to like sort of see where the Knicks and the Nets stuff starts to really converge. We already knew it was converging in terms of like where things could look. But now because the Knicks have made a definitive move here and said, hey, this is what we're going to do. These are the players we're going to do it around. These are the contracts that are pretty much all in place. Like, we can see the next 3 or 4 years in pretty clear detail now. This is where you can start to make real determinations around what those picks are going to be and what their value is going to be later. We'll go through, I noticed I was going to do it a second ago. I'll do it here in a moment. Going to go and look through just what those Knicks picks are going to the Nets over the next couple of years, so we can start thinking about sort of like what their value could be down the line, or maybe even in the short term as well. We'll get into that here in just one moment. First, I'll tell you about our friends over at Game Time. Look, if you're trying to get tickets to the sporting event, you're trying to get it to the concert, music, the concert, the theater, the comedy show, whatever it is, Game Time and Game Time Picks has you covered. It makes getting tickets for your favorite live events so much easier. It's going to filter out the fluff, show you only incredible deals, the great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. It's all there for you on Game Time. You get those super deals out there. You got curated stuff. You got seat views, so you know exactly what you're going to see when you sit down before you even buy the ticket. You get the lowest price guarantee. You get event cancellation protection. It's all there for you over at Game Time. You're going to take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create that account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. All right, I'll finish this off. Take a look at what the Knicks are giving up to the Nets here over the next couple of years, so we just have a really, really clear view of what this is going to look like. Those Knicks picks from the Mikal Bridges trade start in 2020. No, sorry, they start this year, 2025. No protections. We know that this pick is going to be a really low first rounder. The Knicks are going to be very good this year. They can withstand multiple injuries probably and be very good. So that pick is not going to be anything of value. It's going to be a really low first round pick. I mean, almost no matter which way you shake it, at least as far as I'm concerned. Feel free to disagree with me on that one, by the way. If you think that you might think this Knicks team is super fragile the way it's built, right? Like, no bench, Karl-Anthony Towns, right? Tibbs going to run all these guys into the ground. I don't know. Throw a comment on YouTube if you see that a different way. I don't see this team as all that fragile, but that's just Then 2027, we get a first round pick with no protections on it too. That's where you start to think, okay, team is probably still good. Everyone's around 30. We'll see how these next couple of years go. Right. They're still in a window where if like something didn't work, they could probably trade some of these guys. Right. And so it's hard to imagine where that's like just how crazy that's going to be. But where things start to get really interesting around that is around 2028, where the Nets do have the swap rights for the Knicks. And then you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, maybe the Nets are still bad during that point. So, like, how much are they really going to be able to swap? I don't know. It's hard to imagine the Nets are better than the Knicks at that point. So probably not. And then 2029, though, these are the ones where it's like, oh, okay, the 2029 pick and the 2031 pick. Again, are we all going to be in the retirement home by then? Maybe I will be sooner than any of you are. And maybe we're speaking about times that are just so far out in the future that's crazy to think about. But remember, we're not speaking about it about even right now, thinking about, oh, who are the Nets going to pick in 2029, right? Like whatever that is, a seventh grader, are the Nets really projecting or is going to be there, right? That's not the way we're thinking about it. We're thinking about it strictly in terms of overall league value. And can you tell yourself a story where the Knicks are at the end of the line and they've been a second apron team for a couple of years and like they've been really had a hard time getting any new assets in the door, and they're looking sort of like where the Clippers were at that time, and now the league is really starting to value where those picks are going to be or what they could be? I think that's not a hard story to tell yourself. And that's not me sitting here rooting for the Knicks downfall. Everyone who listens to the podcast knows that I don't really just try to root against other teams. I just really not like that. It's not a fun way for me to engage with sports. I know sometimes people think I'm like rooting for the Knicks or something like that. I mean, even with this cat trade where I complimented the Knicks on the trade, like people were like, oh, you're shilling for the Knicks. I'm not shilling for the Knicks. I don't dislike them. I don't care enough to like root against them. I mean, if it helps the Nets, I'll root against them, but I don't have this great disdain for the Knicks. If you don't like hearing that from a Nets commentator, whatever. I mean, just, there's other stuff to listen to, I suppose, but that's just not how I operate. I look at this on its face and I like the deal for the Knicks. It's not shilling. It's just being honest. I hope the people that listen to the podcast kind of understand that about Adam and I at this point, that this is just how it's just more fun to be honest than it is to just hate something because the colors on the uniform are different or because they play in a different stadium. I always think that's a really silly thing. But when we're looking at, this version of it, and we're thinking about what the values of this stuff could be later on. Yeah, it's important to look at like these picks later on, because I think that there's a world where, the Nets have had a couple maybe very good drafts around guys who could be sort of generational superstars. And then you're in a world maybe not too dissimilar to where OKC was or is, or maybe around Orlando, right? Where it's like, hey, we had a couple good drafts. We have some verifiable superstars on the team now. And now I really want to start to look at, like, is there a way to consolidate a lot of talent around these guys to actually maybe go forward a little sooner? Projecting out and wish casting a little bit. Yeah, of course. I mean, this is sports. What are you going to do? We're going to sit here and be like, hey, they're going to suck in 2030. That would be boring. I wouldn't also be honest, but it would just like not be fun. But this is why that Mikal Bridges trade ended up being so important for the Nets in terms of like thinking about the reset, because when you can tie your reset to your own picks and sort of control a little bit of like you can control a little bit of like how that goes, and then you can also begin to think about like what it means to look at another team and think about where their assets are. Yeah, this is like an important part. This is just a very, very important part of the anyway. This is all to say, I think that when we look at this Knicks trade with Karl-Anthony Towns, I think it does a couple things. One, I think it makes the Knicks better. Or two, I think it puts them in a title window. I would still have them well behind Boston, right? And if all teams are healthy, I think that Boston team is just so good. If they have Staps and he's healthy and everyone else, I think that Boston team's so good that it would be hard for me to ever project anyone over them. I just think that team is like underrated how good they were last year, right? And how easily they won the championship. But it puts the Knicks in that conversation. That's a cool place to be for a franchise. The Nets, we liked it when we were fans of a team that was in that window, and it's fun to be in that window as a fan. So I think that it firmly, to me, puts the Knicks in that range. But when you make definitive moves in the short term that are going to help you for a couple of years, but maybe the future is a little cloudier, then if the Nets are there to capitalize on the back of it based on specifically what happened with this Mikal Bridges trade, hey, we got to keep an eye on it, right? We have to be able to know what that is. We have to know how the rest of the league is going to view it. We have to think about what it could mean for the Nets later on. And if it means rooting against the Knicks in the short term and maybe even the medium term or the long term in a more sort of definitive way than we already were, I'm all for it. That's just the nature of the business. All right, we are going to get out of here. More Nets media stuff coming out over the course of this week as they start getting to the microphone, talking about the season. We'll talk more about what Jordi Fernandez and what Sean Marks had to say about the upcoming season. Some interesting quotes that came out of last week out of those media pressers. So we'll get into all of that as we go. Make sure you are subscribed over to Locked On Nets on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Always get to the end of this. Remember that Adam's always so good at curating those quotes from the great American poets. I'll just say once again, Adam Armbrecht, one of the great American poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.